In this video, we'll be taking a look at basic selections inside of Photoshop, as well as some of the essential tools that you will need to create selections. Now, first off, what is the purpose of a selection? A selection allows you to designate a collection of pixels on your document so that you can do something to them. Maybe you need to move those pixels. Maybe you need to constrain your paintbrush work to only exist on that selection of pixels. Maybe you need to apply an effect just to a given area. It can all be handled via selections, and there are a lot of different ways to create selections inside of Photoshop. And over this and the next few videos, we'll be exploring many of those techniques. However, we're going to start off with probably the most basic selection tool you have, which is the rectangular marquee tool. This is located as the second button down in the tools panel. If you don't see it, you can hold down the left mouse button and choose it from the top of the list. You can also tap the M key, M as in Mike, to be able to jump right to this tool at any time. Now, assuming that all of your settings are at their defaults, if you were to click and drag in your document window, you will get a basic selection inside of Photoshop. So here you can see that I've selected kind of a nice big rectangle that covers the eyes and most of the nose of this koala. Now, in case you were wondering, this koala image is from the Windows 7 sample images, which doesn't really matter. If you want to use any image, you can. If you just want to do this in a blank document, that'll be just as well. Now, around the edges of this selection, you'll notice that you have some little black and white tick marks that are kind of marching around the edge of the selection. These are called marching ants, and you've probably seen these in Photoshop before, and there are several other applications that use similar systems as well. It's just a way for you to know what pixels are selected. Now, you won't necessarily always see marching ants. I just kind of want to mention this very casually right now, and it'll become more of a noticeable thing as we move forward. If you have a pixel that is selected not to its full percentage, you can actually select pixels to a percentage. Like a pixel on your document can be 50% selected, meaning like if you were to try to delete it, you would delete only 50% of it. It'd be like setting the transparency of that pixel to 50%. If a pixel is 50% selected or less, you will not see marching ants around it. However, Photoshop is generally pretty good about letting you know when that's happening. You'll see a window that pops up, and that's something that we may see happen as we move forward. I just kind of want to mention that the marching ants are not a hardcore given. If you have a complex selection with a lot of fading going on, there will be some pixels that technically are selected, at least up to a point, and you won't see any marching ants around them. Okay, so there's the basics of a marquee selection. It's just a rectangle. You just drag it out, and it takes on whatever you want. Now, what can you do from here? Well, a lot of things, really. If you were to get your paintbrush out, for example, and you can see that I have some red paint selected, if I clicked and drag out here in my document, like I'm trying to paint on our koala's paw right now, and I'm not really getting anywhere, but if I drag inside this selection, you see that we can paint. So what I've done is I've constrained the area where I can have anything happen to my document by setting up a selection. Now I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo that. If you want to get rid of a selection at any time, you can do a couple of things. If you already have a selection, you can just click with the Marquee Selection tool. Do not drag, just click in a single spot, and that will get rid of your direction. Though really 9 times out of 10, I use the hotkey for this, which is Control-D, and that's an automatic deselection. I use that quite a bit. Now let's talk for just a moment about the options available along our options bar for the Marquee Select tool. There really aren't that many. First off, we have the Selection Booleans area. This allows you to choose how your next selection will affect your selection as a whole. Now, I was thinking earlier that I might break these out into their own video, but since we're kind of considering this selection basics, and since you'll see this a lot, we'll go ahead and cover it here. Your default setting is just going to create a new selection each time you drag. So if I drag a selection square around the right eye of our koala, and then I try to drag another square around his left eye, you see what happens. We just get a brand new square, or a brand new rectangle, technically, a marquee. If I select the next option over, which is Add to Selection, watch what happens when I drag a box around the left eye. We get a second selection. So if I was to get my paintbrush out, I can paint in this area, and I can paint in this area. Now I'll hit Control-Alt-Z a couple of times to deselect those. Now back over to the Marquee tool. Let's go ahead and hit Control-D to get rid of that selection. Our next button over allows us to remove from a selection or subtract from a selection. So if I select this, and just start off by making a brand new selection. It looks just like any other selection I might make. Let's grab some pixels here on his back, actually. So I'll hit Control D. We'll grab some back here. So we have this little tiny box on the koala's back. Now notice my cursor has a little tiny crosshair with a subtraction sign, a minus right next to it. That means that my next selection is going to remove from my current selection. The interesting thing about that is that if I'm sitting here dragging out here in open space, you can't really well, you won't get any sort of response because we're subtracting from something that isn't currently selected. Now, to make this I guess to make it a little more visually outstanding, let me do something real quick. I'm going to pop open our jellyfish picture. This is also included with the Windows 7 sample images, and I just feel like using this instead will be a little more visible on the screen for some of these more complicated selections I'll be making. So, here is one great big selection, and notice again, I still have my minus sign, and if I make another selection that overlaps the first, you see that we subtracted the overlapping area from our final selection. And I can continue to do that and make a really interesting selection so that if I feel like it, just drop down a new layer so I'm being all non-destructive and stuff. I can paint inside this selection, and there you go. We get a very interesting shape out of that. So I'll go ahead and throw that away. Now, let's hit M to go back to the marquee tool. The next one over is the intersect with selection option. Now, if I'd make a brand new selection, this doesn't look special at all. If I drag out here in space, we get a warning. It says no pixels were selected. What does that mean? What intersect is looking for are your two selections to actually overlap one another, and where they do, you only get the area where the two selections overlapped. This means that if you make two selections that do not overlap, say here and here, there's no overlappage, meaning there's no intersection, meaning you have no selection. So use these. For example, if we know for a fact that we want to start off with a selection of our jellyfish, and I'll just set this over to normal selection, and we'll make a big box around him, but then I decide, you know what, I don't really want the tendrils to appear, I just kind of want the head of our jellyfish. Then I can go over and grab, just for an example, subtract from selection, drag another box over like so, and boom, we've just chopped that out. We can maybe cut it even a little closer as well, like so. So it's a nice way to make adjustments to your current selection. Now let's move over to some of our other options as well. Next, we have feather. This allows you to apply a softening effect around the outsides of your selection. So let's set this to something fairly high so we can see the result. So we'll set this to 20 pixels, and let me go ahead and switch over to new selection and drag and take a close look at the selection box that appears. It's rounded, kind of like an old school television screen. If I grab the move tool just as an example, actually, let's not use the move tool. I don't want to confuse things too terribly much. I'll just drop on a new layer and I'll grab my paintbrush and paint in this area and take a close look at what we ended up with. In fact, I'm going to hit Control D to deselect so you can see the result. Now, just for comparison's sake, I'm going to make a brand new selection with no feathering. And we'll make this right next to the first one. And I'll get my paintbrush tool out again, and I'll fill this in, and hit Control D to deselect, and you can see the result. The outer edge of the selection was softened, and it creates this nice blurring effect of what it is you have selected. You'd have to be a little bit careful with this. This can make your selections a little on the messy side, but if you really do need some softening, if you don't want a hard edge, then feathering is definitely where you need to go. And of course, in this particular example, I've overdone it just a little bit. Now let's move over. The next option you see is anti-alias, which is grayed out. That's because this is something that is really only pertinent for things like the elliptical marquee tool, which we'll actually talk about a little bit later. But the idea is that the pixels of your selection are going to be softened around edges that are not perfectly straight. Where they are perfectly straight, there's no need to soften them, which is why this gets grayed out. If you are unfamiliar with the concept of anti-aliasing, consider a diagonal line made out of pixels. If you get really close to it, it's just going to look like a series of stair steps. And what anti-aliasing does is it blurs out that line so you don't see so many harsh, jagged pixels poking out. Of course, if your selection is perfectly horizontal and vertical lines, which are parallel with the edges of a pixel, you'll never get that, which is why anti-aliasing isn't available for marquee selection. Next, we have the style of our selection. This is pretty cool. By default, this is set to normal, meaning you can drag this out to any size and ratio that makes you happy. Let's hit Control D. If you switch this to fixed ratio, you can establish a ratio of width to height here. So currently I have this set to 1 by 2 in height. So as I drag out, no matter where I try to drag my mouse, my selection is always going to be twice as tall as it is wide. I can click on the little button in between the width and height to reverse the numbers, and now my selection will always be twice as wide as it is tall. So if you know you need to make a selection that fits a specific ratio, such as a widescreen TV format or something like that, then you can go ahead and set that ratio here. It's extremely useful. Next, we have fixed size, and this allows you to punch in a pixel value. So we could say we need something that is 128 pixels by 256 pixels. Actually, notice by default this was set to inches. Without trying to digress too far, and this is something that I'll talk a little bit more about rulers a little later on, if I hit Control R, notice that this brings up my rulers, and my rulers by default are set to inches. There's no problem with that. That's just kind of Photoshop's way of telling us, hey, right now you're working in inches by default. If I right click and switch this over to pixels, and then now notice we have a little measurement of pixels all the way across our image. I can hit Control R again to hide that, and now if I say 128 and press enter, notice that it immediately knows that I meant pixels when I said that. So I've just kind of switched over the metric by which Photoshop is measuring all of our distances. So now I've established 128 by 256, and if I click and drag, my selection cannot be changed in size. I'm just moving that selection around by the upper left corner. Make sense so far? Cool. All right, next we have the Refine Edge button. This allows us to change how the edge looks, and this is very much like the masking selection. In fact, this is exactly like the Refine Edge tool that comes over with the mask window, which we've already gone over in the video over the masks panel, but at a quick glance, we can change the view mode to control how we see the results of this selection if we want to see things like marching ants, or if we want to see it on black or on white, etc. We can show the radius of edge detection. We can show our original, which is already showing in this particular case. We can control the radius around which the edges are going to be sought out, which is not really going to have too much of an effect in this particular case because a marquee selection is so simple by nature. We can smooth this out, so you can see as I apply smoothing, the corners are getting rounded. We can apply feathering if we want to soften. You can really drive that pretty crazy, but the cool thing about doing it this way as opposed to adding feathering in our options box for the marquee selection tool is we can see what the result is going to look like before we actually create the selection, which is very handy. We can boost the contrast on that. So here's a nice way to get a rounded rectangle selection very quick and easily. Just go ahead, jump into your Refine Edge window, and you can just apply some smoothing and then boost the contrast, maybe add a little bit of feathering, and there you go. You have a very nice, smooth looking rounded rectangle. And then we can decontaminate the colors if we're getting some odd colors in here, but this selection is so simple we shouldn't need any of that. Click OK, and this is now our new selection. So again, it's just a way for you to control how your selection ended up. Now, all of that done, that covers the Marquee Select tool in its most basic form. Now, let's go ahead and talk about some of the other selection tools while we're at it. We have the Elliptical Marquee tool, which is really, in the end, exactly the same as the Marquee Selection tool, except you're drawing ellipses. Now, these ellipses can be wide, they can be tall. If you hold down the Shift key, you will get a perfect circle. And I suppose it's important for me to also mention that with the rectangular marquee tool, if I go ahead and switch this back over to normal, so it'll be a little easier to select, I can hold down Shift and always get a perfect square. Also, and this is important too, but I find myself using it more often with the elliptical marquee tool than with the rectangular one. If I hold down the Alt key and drag, I'm dragging my selection out from the center as opposed from the corner. So if you try that, by default, if you just click and drag, you're dragging out from the upper corner, or lower corner, I guess, depending on the direction you move your mouse. If you hold down the Alt key instead while you're dragging, you are instead dragging out from the center, which is very cool. Just to show that also working with a rectangular tool, there you are. If you hold down Alt and Shift at the same time, you will get a perfect circle or perfect square drawn from the center, which is very handy if you already have a perfect circle and you know right where the center of it is on your image. Now, back to the elliptical tool, all of the options are the same, save the idea that you can anti-alias the edges of your circle. And here's what I mean by that. If I make a nice anti-aliased circular selection, and let's maybe to make a kind of a wide one, and I'll click and drag that. Let me talk about that here in just a moment. I can hit delete, And before I even do that, let's see here. Let's switch this over to the background color. That'll probably be the easiest. And we'll fill that in with white and hit Control D. And you can see where that's a nice, smooth ellipse. And if I hit Control 1 to kind of get us zoomed in a little, you can see how nicely smoothed out that is. If, however, I switch off anti-alias and I drag out a similar selection and hit Delete, and again, we'll switch that to background color, click OK, Control D, you can see we get all these little tiny jaggies. Now, I'm not sure exactly how well that's going to translate on the video, but if I zoom in a bit, you can really see the difference between the two here. We have nice smoothing on our anti-alias one and big chunky jaggies on the other. So generally when making elliptical selections, it's a good idea to leave anti-aliasing on pretty much at all times. So there's a look at the elliptical and rectangular marquee tools. Before I move away from those, I do want to mention something that I kind of took for granted there for just a moment. If you have the new selection option available in your various Boolean operations here, when you put your mouse over an actual selection you've already made, you'll notice you get a little tiny white arrow with a selection box next to it. This means you are moving the selection around. It's very handy in case you drop down a selection and then decide you need it elsewhere. You can just move it around and replace the selection. You'd have to be a little bit careful if you had at some point switched over to the move tool, you're doing something else entirely. You're actually grabbing those pixels that were selected and you're relocating them, which you may or may not want to do. Just thought I would mention the difference between the two. We'll hit Control D and put that right back where it was. Okay, so there's a quick rundown of those tools. What else is there? If I look underneath the rectangular and elliptical marquee tool, there are the single row and single column marquee tools. These are about as straightforward as you can get, really. They are placed with a single click, and what these do is select an entire row or an entire column of pixels in case you need to do something with a single 1-pixel row. Now, generally, I find myself using this more often with web work than with anything else, but you can see we do have a nice column of pixels selected there. So that's it. That's the basics of selection, as well as your most fundamental selection tools being the marquee tools. Now, again, a selection is just a way for you to designate an area of pixels, either for the application of an effect or to constrain something that you're doing to a given area. And that is going to wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot for watching.